Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most remarkable stories of cultural survival in American history. A story about people who were stolen from Africa, brought to the most isolated corners of the American South, and somehow managed to hold onto their languages, their traditions, their very identities in ways that no other group in North America achieved. We're stepping into the world of the Gullah people, the descendants of enslaved Africans who settled the Sea Islands and coastal low country of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. While slavery tried to strip away everything that made them who they were, the Gullah found ways to preserve, adapt, and pass down traditions that still breathe today. This is a story about resistance through culture, about memory as rebellion, about what survives when survival itself seems impossible. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with geography, because geography explains almost everything about how the Gullah culture came to exist and why it survived when so many other African traditions in America didn't. The Sea Islands are a chain of barrier islands stretching along the Atlantic coast from the southern tip of North Carolina, down through South Carolina and Georgia, and into northern Florida. They're separated from the mainland by marshes, tidal creeks, and rivers that twist through the low country like veins through a body. In the colonial era, these islands were among the most isolated places in British North America. No bridges connected them to the mainland. The only way to reach them was by boat, navigating waterways that shifted with the tides, that could strand an unfamiliar traveler in plough mud that would swallow them to the waist. The isolation was a curse for the enslaved people brought there, cutting them off from any hope of escape to freedom. But it was also, paradoxically, a gift, because that same isolation meant that white oversight was limited, that plantation owners often lived on the mainland and visited only occasionally, that the cultural space in which enslaved people lived was less policed than anywhere else in the American South. The rice that grew in these coastal marshes is why any of this happened. Rice cultivation requires specific knowledge, specific skills, specific technology that Europeans didn't possess. But the people of the rice coast of West Africa, the region stretching from present-day Senegal down through Sierra Leone, Liberia, and into Côte d'Ivoire, they had been growing rice for centuries. They knew how to build the dikes and canals that controlled water flow through the paddies. They knew when to flood the fields and when to drain them. They knew how to process the harvested grain, using mortars and pestles and winnowing baskets that were virtually identical to tools still used in West African villages today. So the planters of the Carolina Low Country didn't just want enslaved Africans. They wanted specific enslaved Africans, people from the rice-growing regions who could teach them how to cultivate this lucrative crop. The advertisements in Charleston newspapers were explicit. Wanted, Africans from the Windward Coast, experienced in rice cultivation. This wasn't random. This was targeted human trafficking, selecting for cultural knowledge that would be exploited for profit. The result was a concentration of people from particular regions of Africa that was unusual in the Americas. Most enslaved populations in the New World were deliberately mixed, slaveholders believing that people who couldn't communicate with each other were less likely to rebel, less likely to maintain dangerous solidarities. But in the Low Country, economic incentives overrode these concerns. the plantations filled with people from similar cultural backgrounds, people who spoke related languages, who shared religious beliefs and social customs, who recognized each other as coming from the same broad region, even if they weren't from the exact same ethnic group. The Mende, the Temne, the Vai, the Kissi, the Kapele. These were the peoples who found themselves concentrated on the Sea Islands, bringing with them traditions that would blend and transform, but never completely disappear. Now imagine arriving on one of these islands in the 1700s. You've survived the Middle Passage, that nightmare journey across the Atlantic that killed so many of your fellow captives. You've been sold at auction in Charleston, inspected and purchased like livestock, your humanity denied by every aspect of the transaction. And now you're being transported by boat through winding waterways to an island that will be your prison for the rest of your life. The landscape is strange, but also familiar in unsettling ways. The heat, the humidity, the marshes and rivers, the palm trees swaying in the breeze, all of it echoes the coastal regions of West Africa you were stolen from. It's not home, but it rhymes with home in ways that both comfort and torment. The air smells of salt and mud and decay, the particular perfume of tidal marshland that anyone who has spent time in the low country would recognize. Herons stalk through the shallows, alligators sun themselves on the banks. The sounds of insects fill the air with a buzz that never quite stops. You're put to work almost immediately because rice cultivation is labor-intensive and the planters want returns on their investment. The work is brutal in ways that are hard to overstate. You stand in water up to your knees for hours at a time, planting rice seedlings, weeding the paddies, harvesting the mature crop. The water is warm and fetid, thick with mosquitoes that carry malaria and other diseases that will kill many of your fellow workers. The sun beats down relentlessly, and there's no shade in the open paddies. Your back aches from bending. Your hands blister and bleed. The overseers watch and punish anyone who slows down. This is the context in which Gullah culture emerged, in the midst of suffering that should have destroyed any possibility of cultural continuity. And yet it didn't. Because in the evenings, in the quarters, in the spaces between work, people found ways to remember. Here's where the story becomes something more than tragedy. The task system used on low-country plantations was different from the gang labor system used in other parts of the South, and that difference shaped everything about how Gullah culture developed and survived. Under the gang system, which dominated cotton plantations in the Deep South, enslaved people worked in groups from sunrise to sunset. Their pace, dictated by overseers, their time never their own. Under the task system, each enslaved person was assigned a specific amount of work to complete each day: a quarter acre of rice to hoe, a certain number of rows to plant, a defined quantity to harvest. Once that task was finished, your time was your own. This might sound like a small thing, but it was revolutionary in its implications. It meant that skilled workers who completed their tasks quickly had hours each day that belonged to them. A strong, experienced field hand might finish by early afternoon, leaving the rest of the day for other pursuits. It meant that families could garden, cultivating their own plots of land where they grew vegetables and raised chickens and pigs. It meant they could hunt in the forests and fish in the abundant waters surrounding the islands, supplementing the rations provided by planters with food they procured themselves. It meant they could raise livestock, accumulating small amounts of property that represented something like wealth in an economy that treated them as property themselves. Some enslaved people on the Sea Islands actually sold surplus produce and eggs and fish, earning cash that they saved for years, sometimes managing to purchase their own freedom or the freedom of family members. The task system wasn't designed as a kindness. Nobody was trying to make enslaved lives easier. It emerged because rice cultivation required careful, skilled labor that couldn't be rushed without damaging the crop. The flooding and draining of paddies had to happen at specific times. The seedlings had to be planted at correct depths and spacing. The harvest had to be timed precisely. Rushed, sloppy work would ruin the crop and cost the planter money. So the planters found it more profitable to assign tasks and let workers complete them at their own pace than to force gang labor that produced inferior results. The economic logic was entirely selfish, but the unintended consequence was the creation of a semi-autonomous cultural space that existed nowhere else in enslaved America. In the evenings, after the tasks were done, in the quarters where the enslaved people lived, a different world came to life. This was where children learned the language their parents spoke. Not just English, but the Creole tongue that blended English words with African grammar and meaning. This was where elders told stories, tales that had traveled across the Atlantic in the memories of the stolen, transformed by new circumstances, but recognizable in their structures and morals. This was where young people learned crafts from their parents and grandparents, the basket weaving and wood carving and textile arts that connected them to ancestors they would never meet. This was where religious practices unfolded, the ring shouts and prayer meetings and rituals that maintained spiritual connections to Africa and to each other. The quarters were crowded and rough, the cabins small and poorly built, but they were also spaces of community and culture, places where being Gullah meant something specific and valuable. The language that emerged in this space is one of the most remarkable features of Gullah culture, and understanding it helps you understand how deeply African the Gullah remained even after generations in America. It's not simply English with an accent, despite what outsiders assumed for centuries. It's a Creole language, a fusion of English vocabulary with grammatical structures drawn from various West African languages. The way verbs are conjugated, the way sentences are constructed, the way meaning is conveyed through tone and rhythm, all of it reflects African linguistic patterns layered onto English words. When a Gullah speaker says, "Eda go da market," meaning he is going to the market, the grammar follows patterns found in Menda and other West African languages, not English grammar. When they say, "Dem chillin da play," the plural marker dem and the continuous aspect marker da come directly from African linguistic traditions. The language wasn't a corruption of English, despite what white observers claimed. It was a creative synthesis, a new tongue born from the collision of worlds that allowed people from different African ethnic groups to communicate while preserving deep structures of African thought. The vocabulary of Gullah included hundreds of words borrowed directly from African languages, words that have sometimes passed into wider American usage without anyone knowing their origins. Bukra, meaning a white person, comes from the Efik and Ibibio languages of Nigeria. Kuta, the common low-country word for turtle, traces back to the Bambara and Malinka languages of West Africa. Guba, which became the American word for peanut, comes from the Congo word nguba. Gumbo, the name for both the vegetable okra and the stew made from it, derives from the Bantu word for okra. Tote, meaning to carry, comes from Kikongo and has spread into general American English. The Gullah were walking lexicons of African linguistic survival, their everyday speech carrying words that had crossed the Atlantic in the mouths of the stolen and taken root in American soil. For generations, white people dismissed Gullah as broken English, as evidence of intellectual inferiority, as something to be ashamed of and educated away. Teachers punished children for speaking Gullah in school. Employers refused to hire people who couldn't speak proper English. The message was clear. The way you talk marks you as ignorant, as backward, as less than. The speakers themselves sometimes internalize this shame, learning to code switch between Gullah at home and English in public, teaching their children to hide their native tongue, saving the language for family, for trusted friends, for the spaces where white judgment didn't reach. This linguistic shame was a form of cultural violence, an attempt to erase something precious by making people embarrassed to possess it. But linguists who actually studied Gullah discovered something that should have been obvious from the start. It was a fully functional language with consistent grammatical rules, expressive capacity, and a rich vocabulary perfectly suited to the lives of the people who spoke it. Lorenzo Dow Turner, a black linguist from Howard University, conducted groundbreaking research in the 1930s and 1940s, recording Gullah speakers, analyzing their language, and demonstrating definitively its connections to African tongues. He found thousands of personal names, words, and phrases that could be traced directly to specific African languages. His work, published as Africanisms in the Gullah dialect in 1949, validated what Gullah speakers had always known deep down. Their language was not degraded English, but a legitimate tongue with roots that reached across the ocean to the homelands their ancestors had been stolen from. The spiritual traditions that survived on the Sea Islands were equally remarkable, representing one of the most complete retentions of African religious practice anywhere in the Americas. The ring shout is perhaps the most dramatic example, a form of worship that combines music, movement, and religious ecstasy in ways that trace directly back to West African practice. Participants form a circle and move counterclockwise, shuffling their feet in a pattern that carefully avoids crossing, because crossed feet would make it dancing rather than worship, and dancing was forbidden in many Christian contexts. The distinction might seem like a technicality, but it was a brilliant adaptation that allowed African movement traditions to continue under the guise of acceptable Christian practice. The movement builds in intensity as singers chant call and response patterns, the rhythm driven by hand claps and stick beats on the floor. The songs are called shouts, and the singing is called shouting, though it's as much chanting as singing in the conventional sense. The shout could go on for hours, participants entering trance states that connected them to the spirit world, their bodies moving in patterns their ancestors would have recognized. The counterclockwise direction was significant, mirroring practices documented in West African religious ceremonies. The call and response structure echoed African musical traditions. The building intensity, leading to altered states of consciousness, paralleled ecstatic religious practices across the African diaspora. When observers first witnessed ring shouts on the Sea Islands during the Civil War, they described them with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, recognizing that they were seeing something ancient and powerful, something that had survived the Middle Passage and generations of bondage. This wasn't something that developed after slavery. It was already old by then, already woven into the fabric of community life, already essential to how the Gullah understood their relationship to the divine. The religious world of the Gullah was a complex blend of Christianity and African belief that scholars call syncretism, though that word doesn't quite capture the seamless integration the Gullah achieved. They attended church, sang hymns, learned Bible stories, and professed Christian faith with genuine conviction. The Christianity offered by missionaries provided a vocabulary for expressing spiritual truths, stories of liberation that resonated with enslaved people, and a promise of ultimate justice that made present suffering bearable. But beneath and alongside this Christianity flowed currents of African spirituality that never fully disappeared, that blended so thoroughly with Christian practice that separating them became impossible. Root doctors practiced healing arts that combined herbal medicine with spiritual intervention, using knowledge passed down through generations. They knew which plants cured which ailments, knowledge that had crossed the Atlantic and adapted to American flora. But they also knew that some illnesses had spiritual causes, that enemies could work roots against you, that protection required both physical remedies and spiritual interventions. A root doctor might prescribe an herb tea alongside a protective charm, might diagnose both a physical ailment and a spiritual attack, might treat the body and the soul as the interconnected whole that African philosophy understood them to be. Protective charms called hands or mojos were carried to ward off evil spirits and bring good luck. These small bundles of roots, bones, and other objects held power that believers took seriously, power to protect, to attract love, to ensure success. The Platai, a malevolent spirit that could appear in various forms to terrify or harm the unwary, was universally feared. It might appear as an animal, as a person, as something indescribable that lurked at crossroads and in dark places. Travelers at night took precautions against encountering Platais. Stories of encounters circulated through the community, serving both as entertainment and as warnings about the dangers of the spirit world. The dead were buried with broken possessions so their spirits could use them in the afterlife, a practice with clear parallels in West African funerary traditions. Mirrors were covered when someone died so the departing spirit wouldn't be trapped. Bodies were carried out feet first so the spirit wouldn't find its way back. The line between the living and the dead was thin and permeable, and proper respect for ancestors was essential for maintaining harmony between the worlds. Let's talk about the crafts, because material culture survives in ways that oral tradition sometimes doesn't, and the Gullah preserved remarkable skills that linked them directly to Africa across centuries and thousands of miles of ocean. The sweetgrass baskets of the Low Country are the most famous example. Coiled baskets made from sweetgrass, bulrush, and palmetto fronds, sewn together with strips of palm leaf, in a technique that requires skill, patience, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The technique is identical to basket-making traditions in Senegal and Sierra Leone, not similar, not influenced by, but actually the same method that women in West African villages use today. The coiling technique, the materials, the shapes, the purposes, all of it connects the Gullah basket makers to their African ancestors through an unbroken chain of teaching and learning. These weren't just beautiful objects, though they are beautiful, the tight coils forming patterns that catch light and shadow, the natural materials giving each basket a unique character. They were functional tools essential to rice cultivation, used for winnowing the grain, separating the edible kernels from the chaff. The fanna baskets, used in the Low Country rice fields, were the same design, made with the same technique, as baskets used in the rice paddies of West Africa. The enslaved women who made them were practicing a skill their grandmothers had practiced, their great-grandmothers, going back generations to a time before the slave ships came. Every basket was a connection to that past, a demonstration that the knowledge had survived, that the hands still knew what to do even after everything else had been taken. When you see a Gullah woman selling sweetgrass baskets at a roadside stand outside Charleston today, you're seeing a tradition that has survived 4 centuries and crossed an ocean. The baskets have become expensive art objects now, collector's items that can sell for hundreds or even thousands of dollars. But they're still made the same way, still using materials gathered from the low-country marshes, still passed down from mother to daughter in family traditions that stretch back to Africa. The basket makers are cultural custodians, keeping alive a skill that connects them to ancestors they never met, demonstrating through their work that some things cannot be destroyed no matter how hard the circumstances try. Other crafts survived as well, though none as completely as the baskets. Wood carving traditions produced walking sticks and grave markers with designs that echoed African prototypes. Net making for fishing used techniques with African origins. Textile traditions, though disrupted by the availability of manufactured cloth, survived in quilting patterns and clothing styles that reflected African aesthetics. The Gullah made beauty from whatever materials were available, and the forms that beauty took carried memories of the places their ancestors came from. The food traditions were equally persistent, so much so that the cuisine of the Low Country, which has become fashionable in recent decades as Southern cooking or soul food, is in many ways Gullah cuisine, which is in many ways African cuisine adapted to American ingredients and circumstances. Rice was central, of course, served at almost every meal, prepared in ways that would be familiar to anyone from the rice coast of West Africa. The Gullah cooked rice so that each grain stood separate, fluffy rather than sticky, using techniques that required practice to master. They made rice breads and rice puddings and rice fritters. They combined rice with beans and vegetables and bits of meat in one-pot dishes that stretched limited resources into satisfying meals. Rice wasn't just food. It was identity, a daily practice that connected them to the crop their ancestors had cultivated for centuries, the crop that had been the reason they were brought to these islands in the first place. Okra, a vegetable indigenous to West Africa, appeared in gumbos and stews and fried dishes, its mucilaginous texture thickening liquids in ways that took getting used to, but became essential to the cuisine. Beni seeds, which we now call sesame, came from Africa and were cultivated in Gullah gardens for their oil and their distinctive nutty flavor. They appeared in cookies and candies, in sauces and seasonings, a taste of home that had somehow survived the crossing. Black-eyed peas, eaten on New Year's Day for luck throughout the South, were an African crop, and the Gullah prepared them in traditional ways that had traveled across the Atlantic. Hoppin' John, that iconic low-country dish of rice and black-eyed peas, is essentially African in its conception, a combination of ingredients and flavors that could have come from the rice coast. The one-pot rice dishes that became low-country staples reflected West African cooking traditions where rice was combined with whatever vegetables and proteins were available. Chicken purloo, shrimp and rice, red rice cooked with tomatoes. All of these dishes had African roots that the Gullah maintained and adapted. The cooking techniques mattered too. The slow simmering that allowed flavors to meld, the layering of ingredients at different stages of cooking, the use of smoked meats and fish to add depth. Even the cooking implements, the large cast iron pots that every Gullah kitchen possessed, echoed the communal cooking pots of African villages. When you eat at a Gullah restaurant today, when you taste the flavors of the Low Country, you're tasting history, a history that began in Africa and survived against all odds on the sea islands of Carolina and Georgia. The isolation that preserved these traditions began to break down after the Civil War, but in ways that were both harmful and helpful to Gullah cultural continuity. When Union forces captured the sea islands early in the war, in November 1861, the white planters fled to the mainland in panic, leaving behind the enslaved population and the land they had worked for generations. Suddenly, almost overnight, the Gullah found themselves in a peculiar position. Technically free, living on abandoned plantations, with no clear authority over them and no clear idea of what would happen next. The Port Royal experiment, as it came to be known, was one of the first attempts to transition from slavery to freedom, a testing ground for ideas about what emancipation might look like. Northern missionaries and teachers flooded the islands, bringing education and Christianity and new economic arrangements. They established schools where Gullah children learned to read and write, often for the first time in their family's history. They preached in churches, bringing their own brands of Christianity that sometimes conflicted with the syncretic faith the Gullah had developed. They tried to organize labor, to teach former slaves to work for wages, to prepare them for citizenship in a nation that wasn't sure it wanted them as citizens. Some of these northerners documented Gullah culture with genuine curiosity and respect. They recorded songs and stories, described customs and beliefs, left accounts that historians still rely on today. Charlotte Fortin, a black teacher from Philadelphia, kept a diary that provides invaluable glimpses into Gullah life during this transitional period. Others among the missionaries tried to stamp Gullah culture out as primitive, as obstacles to progress, as remnants of heathenism that needed to be replaced with proper civilization. They attempted to replace Gullah language with proper English, correcting children's speech, punishing those who slipped into their native tongue. They tried to replace African-influenced religion with respectable Protestantism, discouraging the ring shouts and the spiritual practices they found disturbing or incomprehensible. They tried to replace traditional practices with modern ones, assuming that their ways were better simply because they were northern, because they were white, because they came from places that seemed more advanced. The cultural imperialism was well-intentioned in some cases, cynical in others, damaging regardless of intent. The Gullah people navigated these pressures as they had navigated everything else, adopting what seemed useful, resisting what felt like erasure, maintaining core traditions while adapting to new circumstances. They learned to read and write, skills that open new possibilities and new forms of resistance. They accepted Christianity more fully, but on their own terms, maintaining the ring shouts and the spiritual practices that the missionaries wanted them to abandon. They worked with the new economic systems, but also maintained their own gardens, their own fishing, their own ways of providing for themselves outside the wage economy. They became skilled at presenting one face to outside observers while maintaining another among themselves, a survival strategy that Black Americans would perfect over the coming century. The land itself became a contested resource in ways that continue to echo today. Some Gullah families managed to purchase land during and after the war, taking advantage of tax sales and government programs to acquire ownership of the ground their ancestors had worked as slaves. This land ownership became the foundation of Gullah independence, providing economic security and a physical place where Gullah culture could be practiced and preserved. The Penn School on St. Helena Island, founded by Northern missionaries, became an important institution for education and community development, evolving over the decades into a center for Gullah cultural preservation. But land tenure was often complicated, held in common by families without clear individual titles, passed down through generations according to Gullah custom rather than American law, vulnerable to legal challenges that would become more serious as the islands became more valuable to outside developers. The story of Gullah land loss in the 20th and 21st centuries is its own tragedy, a slow-motion dispossession that continues today. As the sea islands became more accessible, As bridges replaced ferries and roads replaced paths, the very isolation that had protected Gullah culture disappeared. Developers discovered that barrier islands made excellent resorts, that wealthy outsiders would pay premium prices for waterfront property, that land the Gullah had owned for generations was worth fortunes in the new economy of tourism and retirement communities. The heirs property system that had worked for Gullah families became a vulnerability. When land was owned collectively by dozens of family members, as it often was after generations of inheritance, any single heir could force a sale, and developers learned to seek out those willing heirs, to buy their shares and then petition courts to partition the property. Families who had lived on the same land for a century found themselves displaced by legal proceedings they didn't fully understand. Their inheritance converted to cash that disappeared while the land passed to strangers. Hilton Head Island is perhaps the most dramatic example. In the 1950s, it was a Gullah community, home to families who had been there since slavery times, who farmed and fished and lived according to traditions their ancestors had established. By the 1970s, it was becoming a resort destination. Golf courses and gated communities spreading across land that had once grown cotton and rice. The Gullah families were pushed to the margins, their property taxes rising as land values increased, their communities disrupted by development, their way of life increasingly impossible to maintain. Some held on, maintaining small enclaves amid the resort sprawl. Others left, seeking opportunities elsewhere, carrying their culture with them, but losing their connection to the specific place where it had developed. The pattern repeated across the Sea Islands, each bridge and each development project eroding the geographic foundation of Gullah culture. But the culture persisted despite everything. The 20th century saw a gradual awakening of interest in Gullah traditions, both from within the community and from outside scholars. Lorenzo Dow Turner, a black linguist from Howard University, published a groundbreaking study of Gullah in 1949 that demonstrated definitively its connections to African languages. His work validated what Gullah speakers had always known, that their language was not degraded English, but a legitimate tongue with deep roots. Folklorists collected stories, songs, and customs before they could be lost. Community organizations formed to preserve and promote Gullah heritage. The Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, established by Congress in 2006, recognized the national significance of this cultural tradition and provided resources for its preservation. Today, the Gullah Geechee people number somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000, depending on how you count and who you ask. They live on the Sea Islands and the coastal mainland, in cities like Charleston and Savannah, and scattered across the country in diaspora, communities that maintain connections to home. The language is endangered but not dead, still spoken by older community members, being taught to younger generations in cultural programs and schools. The traditions continue, adapted to modern life but still recognizable. Sweetgrass baskets are sold to tourists, but they're also made for community use. The techniques passed from mother to daughter, as they have been for centuries. The ring shout is performed at cultural festivals and in church services. The same movements that enslaved people practiced in secret, now celebrated openly as heritage. The cuisine has become fashionable. Gullah restaurants and cookbooks introducing wider audiences to flavors that were always there waiting to be discovered. The story of the Gullah people is often told as a story of preservation, of holding on to African traditions against all odds. And that's true, but it's not the whole truth. The Gullah didn't simply preserve African culture like insects trapped in amber. They created something new, a culture that was African and American and entirely its own, forged in the specific conditions of the Low Country, shaped by the particular mix of peoples and circumstances that came together on the Sea Islands. The language wasn't any single African language. It was a Creole that emerged from contact between speakers of many tongues. The religion wasn't pure African spirituality. It was a synthesis that incorporated Christianity while maintaining African elements. The foodways combined African and American ingredients in new combinations. The Gullah were creative as well as conservative, innovators as well as preservers, building something that had never existed before while honoring what had come before them. What makes the Gullah story unique is not just what they preserved, but how they preserved it. In most of enslaved America, African cultural elements survived in fragments, in scattered practices and half-remembered traditions, in rhythms and flavors that echoed Africa without maintaining conscious connection to it. The Gullah maintained something more comprehensive, a whole way of life that remained recognizably African in its deep structures, even as it adapted to American circumstances. The reasons were geographical, demographic, and economic. The particular combination of isolation, concentrated population from related African regions, and the task system that created space for cultural autonomy. But the reasons were also human. The deliberate choices of people who decided that remembering mattered, that teaching the children mattered, that maintaining the language and the stories and the practices was worth the effort even when everything around them encouraged forgetting. The elders who kept the traditions alive deserve recognition that they rarely received during their lifetimes. The women who wove baskets and taught their daughters to weave. The men who told stories at night, passing down tales that mixed African folklore with American experience. The root doctors who maintained knowledge of plants and spirits. The church mothers who led the ring shouts and remembered the old songs. The cooks who prepared rice the way their grandmothers had prepared it, who knew that certain dishes required certain techniques that couldn't be shortcut. These people were cultural warriors, engaged in a form of resistance that was quieter than rebellion, but no less important. They ensured that when their great-grandchildren wanted to know where they came from, there would be something to find. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about what it means to carry a culture across an ocean and through centuries of oppression. Think about the enslaved people who arrived on the Sea Islands, speaking languages their captors couldn't understand, practicing religions their captors considered savage, carrying skills and knowledge that their captors exploited without respecting. Think about the choices they made in the margins of their bondage, the time they carved out to maintain what mattered, the traditions they passed to children who passed them to their children. Think about the language that survived, the words that crossed the Atlantic hidden in the mouths of the stolen, planted in new soil and growing into something that connected past and present. Think about the baskets woven from sweetgrass, each coil a link in a chain stretching back to Africa, each basket a statement that this knowledge will not be lost. The Gullah story is ultimately about the persistence of humanity in circumstances designed to deny it. It's about the ways that people create meaning, even when they're told their meanings don't matter. It's about the power of culture to sustain communities through the unsurvivable, to provide identity and continuity when everything else has been stripped away. The enslaved people of the Sea Islands were not supposed to maintain their languages or their religions or their traditions. They were supposed to become blank slates, empty vessels filled only with labor for their master's profit. They refused. Through countless small acts of remembering and teaching and practicing, they refused. And their refusal echoes down to the present. in the Gullah communities that still exist, in the traditions that still continue, in the culture that survived against all odds and continues to survive. So rest now, and let the rhythm of the Gullah story carry you toward sleep. Think of the tidal creeks winding through the marshes, the sweet grass swaying in the salt breeze, the sound of voices speaking a language that bridges continents and centuries. Think of the ring shout spinning counterclockwise under southern stars, the same movement that spun in West African villages before the ships came. Think of the rice fields that demanded so much suffering but also created the conditions for so much survival. The Gullah found a way, against geography and economics and violence and time itself. They found a way, and they're still finding it, still teaching the children, still weaving the baskets, still cooking the rice, still speaking the words that their ancestors spoke. That persistence is what we honor tonight. That persistence is what carries us into peaceful sleep. Let's start with the basic problem, because understanding why Black entrepreneurship during segregation was so difficult requires understanding what you were up against before you even opened your doors. The end of slavery didn't mean the beginning of freedom. Not really. It meant the beginning of a new system designed to keep Black people in their place, which was at the bottom, working for white people, dependent on white people, never accumulating enough wealth or power to threaten white supremacy. The laws that emerged after Reconstruction weren't random cruelties. They were an economic system, a way of ensuring that the labor of Black people continued to benefit white people even after slavery was technically illegal. Sharecropping trapped farmers in cycles of debt. Convict leasing turned minor offenses into years of forced labor. Black codes restricted movement, employment, and opportunity at every turn. And if the laws weren't enough, there was always violence, the ever-present threat that getting too successful, too visible, too uppity would bring down consequences that no court would punish. Now imagine you want to start a business in this environment. You've got a skill. Maybe you're a barber, or a carpenter, or a seamstress. You've got an idea, maybe a grocery store, or a funeral home, or a taxi service. You've got ambition and energy, and the willingness to work harder than anyone should have to work. What you don't have is capital. Banks won't lend to you. White banks consider you too risky, which is code for they don't want Black people accumulating wealth, and there aren't enough Black banks yet to fill the gap. You can't get a business loan the way a white entrepreneur could, can't leverage property you don't own, can't tap into the networks of credit and investment that make American capitalism function. You start with nothing, because nothing is what the system has allocated to you. So you bootstrap. You save pennies from whatever wages you can earn, working for white employers who pay you less than they'd pay white workers for the same labor. You borrow from family members who are almost as poor as you are, pooling resources that are already stretched thin. You join mutual aid societies, those remarkable institutions where Black people contributed small amounts regularly so that members could access funds for emergencies or opportunities. You find a way, because finding a way is what Black survival has always required. But the way is harder and longer and more precarious than anything a white entrepreneur would face. A white man with your skills and your idea could walk into a bank and walk out with a loan. You spend years saving what he could borrow in an afternoon. Let's say you manage to accumulate enough to actually start something. Now you need a location. And location in the Jim Crow South isn't just about foot traffic and rent. It's about where Black people are allowed to operate, which is to say, where white people will tolerate your presence. You can't open a shop on the main commercial street. Not in most southern towns. That space is reserved for white businesses. You're pushed to the margins, to the black part of town, where the roads aren't paved and the city services don't reach, where your potential customers are as poor as you are, and the infrastructure is crumbling. The rent might be cheaper, sure, but so is everything else. The foot traffic, the visibility, the perceived legitimacy. You're starting a business in a neighborhood that white-controlled city governments have deliberately neglected, competing for customers who have limited money because the same system that constrains you constrains them. The lease itself is a minefield. If you're renting from a white landlord, and you probably are because white people own most of the property even in black neighborhoods, you're at their mercy. They can raise your rent arbitrarily, can refuse to make repairs, can evict you for any reason or no reason. There's no appeal, no recourse. The courts won't help you. The law isn't designed to protect black tenants from white landlords. It's designed to protect white property rights, full stop. If you manage to find a black landlord, things might be better. But black property ownership is itself constrained by the same system, so the options are limited. You sign whatever lease you can get, knowing that your business exists at the pleasure of people who might decide tomorrow that they don't want a black business there anymore. Now you need inventory or equipment or supplies, and here the discrimination continues in subtler forms. Wholesalers might refuse to sell to you at all, or might charge you higher prices than they charge white merchants. They know you have fewer options. No, you can't take your business elsewhere because elsewhere will treat you the same way or worse. The commercial relationships that white businesses take for granted, the credit terms and bulk discounts and reliable delivery schedules, are often denied to black entrepreneurs. You pay more for less, delivered late, and you can't complain, because complaining might mean getting cut off entirely. You learn to work with whatever you can get, to build relationships with the few suppliers who will treat you fairly, to make do with inventory that isn't quite what you wanted because it's what was available. And then there's the matter of customers. The segregated economy creates a captive market, in theory. Black people can't shop at white establishments, or can't shop there comfortably, subjected to humiliation and hostility when they try. So they need black businesses to serve their needs, and this creates opportunity. Funeral homes, because white funeral directors won't touch black bodies. Barbershops and beauty, parlors, because white stylists won't serve black clients. Insurance companies, because white insurers won't write policies on black lives or charge premiums that make coverage impossible. In these protected niches, black entrepreneurs can thrive, serving a community that has nowhere else to go. But the captive market is also a constrained market. Your customers are poor, kept poor by the same system that constrains you. Their wages depressed, their opportunities limited, their ability to accumulate wealth systematically undermined. They need your services, but they can't always pay. And you extend credit because they're your neighbors, your church members, your people. Because turning them away feels like betrayal, even when your own bills are due. The white grocer doesn't extend credit to his customers, or extends it on harsh terms that extract maximum profit. You can't do that. Not to people you'll see at church on Sunday, not to people whose struggles mirror your own. So you carry debt you can't afford, and your margins shrink, and the business that looked viable on paper becomes precarious in practice. Let's talk about what happens when you actually succeed, because success brings its own dangers in the Jim Crow economy. The whole system is predicated on black inferiority, on the assumption that black people can't compete, can't build, can't achieve anything without white supervision. When you prove that assumption wrong, when your business thrives and your wealth grows and your success becomes visible, you become a problem. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because your existence contradicts the lies that justify white supremacy. Every successful black entrepreneur is evidence that the system is built on fraud, and the system doesn't appreciate being exposed. The successful black business owner learns to navigate white jealousy carefully. You learn not to display wealth too openly, not to drive a car too nice, not to dress too well when white people might see you. You learn to perform humility even when you've earned pride, to say sir and ma'am to white people who have achieved less than you have, to make yourself small so that you don't become a target. The performance is exhausting, a constant drain on dignity, but the alternative is worse. White businessmen who see you as competition have tools you don't have. They can pressure suppliers to stop selling to you. They can influence local authorities to suddenly discover code violations in your building. They can spread rumors that drive away customers. They can do all of this legally within the constraints of a legal system that serves their interests, and there's nothing you can do about it. And if the legal tools don't work, there's always violence. The history of black entrepreneurship during segregation is littered with businesses that were burned, looted, destroyed by white mobs who couldn't tolerate black success. This wasn't random violence, wasn't the work of isolated criminals. It was systematic terrorism, coordinated attacks designed to destroy black wealth and send a message to anyone who might try to build more. The pattern was recognizable. A black community would begin to prosper, would accumulate visible wealth, would build homes and businesses that contradicted the narrative of black inferiority. And then the violence would come, triggered by some alleged offense, some rumor of a crime, some excuse that everyone understood was just an excuse. Tulsa in 1921 is the most famous example. The Greenwood district that was called Black Wall Street, the most prosperous black community in America, transformed into a smoking ruin in less than 24 hours. Greenwood had everything: hotels and restaurants, theaters and barbershops, law offices and doctors' offices, a hospital and a library, homes ranging from modest to magnificent. It had its own bus line, its own newspapers, its own economy that circulated dollars through the community multiple times before they leaked out to white businesses. The residents had built this from nothing in just a few decades, had created a model of what black America could accomplish when given any space to work. The mob came on May 31st and June the 1st, 1921, sparked by an accusation against a black man that was almost certainly false and definitely didn't justify what followed. White Tulsans armed themselves and invaded Greenwood, shooting residents, looting homes, setting fires that spread until 35 blocks were destroyed. They had airplanes, the first aerial assault on American soil, dropping firebombs and shooting at fleeing residents from above. The National Guard arrived, and instead of stopping the violence, detained black residents in internment camps while their homes burned. When it was over, somewhere between 100 and 300 people were dead, the true number never known, because no one counted carefully, because black deaths didn't require careful counting. 10,000 people were homeless. Greenwood was gone. But Tulsa wasn't unique. It wasn't even unusual. It was the most dramatic example of a pattern that repeated across the country throughout the Jim Crow era. Wilmington, North Carolina, in 1898, saw a white mob overthrow the legally elected city government, killing black residents and driving successful black businessmen out of town permanently. The coup destroyed a thriving black middle class and installed white supremacist rule that lasted for decades. Atlanta in 1906 exploded after newspapers ran inflammatory stories about alleged black crimes, mobs rampaging through black neighborhoods, killing dozens, destroying businesses, sending a message about the limits of black aspiration. Springfield, Illinois, in 1908, the hometown of Abraham Lincoln, saw white mobs lynch black men and drive black families from the city. The violence so shocking that it inspired the founding of the NAACP. Rosewood, Florida, in 1923, was a small town that simply ceased to exist after white mobs from neighboring communities attacked, killing residents and burning every structure until nothing remained. The survivors scattered, never returned, never rebuilt. East St. Louis in 1917 saw white workers, resentful of black migration from the South, attack black neighborhoods in violence that killed hundreds and left thousands homeless. The Red Summer of 1919 brought violence to cities across the country, Chicago and Washington and Elaine, and dozens of other places where black success or black presence or simply black existence provoked white rage. The message was always the same. You can work, you can save, you can build, but we can take it all away whenever we want, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. The psychological weight of this threat is impossible to fully convey. Imagine building a business knowing that success might bring destruction. Imagine saving for years to open a store, pouring your life into making it work, watching it grow, beginning to believe that maybe you'd beaten the odds, and then lying awake at night wondering if tonight is the night the mob comes, if tomorrow you'll wake up to find everything you've built reduced to ashes. The uncertainty was its own form of violence, a constant pressure that never fully lifted. Some black entrepreneurs kept bags packed, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble, their lives always provisional, their security always temporary. Some kept weapons, prepared to defend what they'd built, even knowing they'd be outgunned, even knowing that fighting back would bring even more severe retaliation. Some simply accepted that everything they worked for could vanish in a night, that impermanence was the price of existence, that building anything at all was an act of faith in a world that gave them no reason for faith. The insurance companies wouldn't cover riot damage or wouldn't pay claims when riots occurred, finding technicalities and exclusions that left policyholders with nothing. The government wouldn't compensate victims, wouldn't prosecute perpetrators, wouldn't even acknowledge that crimes had been committed. When Greenwood residents tried to rebuild, the city of Tulsa changed zoning laws to prevent reconstruction, tried to seize the land for a railroad station, put every possible obstacle in the path of recovery. The survivors rebuilt anyway, slowly and painfully, but they never regained what they'd had. You can't restore decades of accumulated wealth overnight. You can't replace the networks and relationships and institutional knowledge that burned with the buildings. You can't heal trauma that never receives justice. Let's get specific about some of the industries where black entrepreneurs managed to carve out space, because the particular constraints shaped particular adaptations. The funeral industry became one of the most successful black business sectors for reasons that are darkly logical. White people wouldn't handle black bodies, wouldn't embalm them, wouldn't prepare them for burial, wouldn't provide the services that grieving families needed. This created an opening that black undertakers filled, building businesses that served their communities in their most vulnerable moments. A successful black funeral home could become the foundation of a family fortune, passed down through generations, relatively protected from white competition, because white people simply wouldn't do the work. The funeral directors became community pillars, respected figures whose businesses touched every family eventually. They extended credit for funerals because families couldn't always pay up front, and they understood that burying the dead with dignity was a community responsibility, not just a business transaction. They often provided additional services, ambulance transportation in the days before public emergency services, meeting spaces for community gatherings, even informal banking services in some cases. The funeral home became an institution central to black community life, and the entrepreneurs who ran them became leaders whose influence extended far beyond their business concerns. Insurance was another industry where black entrepreneurs found opportunity in exclusion. White insurance companies either refused to write policies on black lives or charged premiums so high that coverage was effectively unavailable. The assumption was that black lives were worth less, that black people died younger, that insuring them was too risky. Black-owned insurance companies emerged to fill this gap, starting with mutual aid societies that formalized into proper insurers over time. Companies like North Carolina Mutual, founded in Durham in 1898, grew into significant enterprises, accumulating capital that could be reinvested in the black community, employing hundreds of black workers, demonstrating that black-owned businesses could compete on any terms. The insurance companies faced unique challenges. Their customer base was poorer and did die younger, not because of any inherent characteristic, but because of the conditions imposed by segregation, the poor health care, the dangerous work, the stress of constant discrimination. The actuarial tables had to account for racism's effects without blaming the victims. The companies had to balance community service against business sustainability, providing coverage to people who needed it, while maintaining the reserves necessary to pay claims. Some of them managed this balance brilliantly, becoming anchor institutions that funded black hospitals, black schools, black housing developments, recycling the premiums collected from policyholders back into community development. Banking was perhaps the most constrained sector, but also one of the most important, because without access to capital, black entrepreneurship could never grow beyond subsistence. Black-owned banks emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, struggling against obstacles that would have killed lesser institutions. They couldn't access the Federal Reserve System on equal terms, couldn't borrow from the discount window when liquidity got tight, couldn't participate in the networks of correspondent banking that allowed white banks to manage risk and move money efficiently. They were isolated institutions serving isolated communities, vulnerable to local economic shocks that larger banks could absorb. The customers they served were poor, not by choice, but by systematic design. Their wages depressed by discrimination, their assets limited by exclusion from home ownership and other wealth-building opportunities. Deposits were small, often just a few dollars at a time, the savings of people who couldn't afford to save much. Loan demands often exceeded what conservative banking practice would approve, because the community needed capital desperately and the bank was the only source. The black banker faced an impossible balance. Be generous enough to serve the community's needs, be conservative enough to survive the inevitable crises, and do both with resources that white banks would consider laughably inadequate. Many black banks failed, victims of the same economic forces that destroyed white banks during the Great Depression and other crises, but with none of the safety nets that helped white banks recover. The Freedmen's Savings Bank, established during Reconstruction to serve formerly enslaved people, collapsed in 1874 under the weight of bad investments and mismanagement by its white trustees, wiping out the savings of tens of thousands of black depositors and creating a distrust of banks that lingered for generations. Later black banks were more carefully managed but still vulnerable, their margins too thin, their reserves too limited, their customer base too constrained to absorb serious shocks. But some survived and even thrived. becoming sources of capital for black entrepreneurship that couldn't access white financial institutions. Maggie Walker's St. Luke Penny Savings Bank in Richmond, founded in 1903, became the first bank founded by a black woman and the first headed by a black woman in America. Walker was remarkable, a visionary who understood that economic development required financial infrastructure, that black businesses couldn't grow without black banks to fund them, that the whole ecosystem had to be built simultaneously. She started with the Independent Order of St. Luke, a mutual aid society that she transformed into an enterprise encompassing banking, insurance, and publishing. The bank she founded survived the Depression, survived every crisis that followed, and still exists today, the oldest continuously operating black-owned bank in the country. Mechanics Savings Bank in Richmond, Citizens Savings Bank in Nashville, Douglas National Bank in Chicago. The names alone tell a story of institution building against impossible odds. Each of these banks served as an anchor for black business districts, providing the credit that allowed other businesses to start and grow. They financed homes in an era when black families couldn't get mortgages from white banks. They financed educations in an era when black students couldn't access mainstream student loans. They financed dreams that white America didn't want to see realized, taking risks that white bankers wouldn't take, trusting in communities that the rest of the economy considered worthless. The beauty industry offered particular opportunities for black women who faced double discrimination as both black and female in the business world, but found in hair care and cosmetics a sector where that double identity became an advantage. White companies didn't make products for black women's hair, didn't understand black hair, didn't care about black beauty standards. This neglect created an opening that black women entrepreneurs filled with products designed by people who understood the customers because they were the customers. Madam C.J. Walker, born Sarah Breedlove in Louisiana in 1867, just 2 years after slavery ended, built a hair care empire that made her one of the wealthiest self-made women in America, black or white. Her story is almost too improbable to believe. Born to formerly enslaved parents who died when she was young, orphaned and working as a domestic servant from childhood, married at 14, widowed at 20, struggling through decades of poverty and hardship, before finally, in her 30s, developing the hair care products and business system that would make her fortune. She suffered from a scalp condition that caused hair loss, and her search for a treatment led her to develop her own formulas, products that actually worked, that filled a need that white manufacturers ignored. Walker didn't just create products. She created a business model that was revolutionary in its inclusiveness. She recruited black women to sell her products door to door, training them in sales, techniques, providing them with supplies and support, creating a network of Walker agents who earned money that domestic service could never provide. At its peak, her company employed over 20,000 women, each of them an entrepreneur in miniature, building customer relationships in their communities, earning commissions that provided independence and dignity. The Walker system wasn't just a business. It was economic empowerment on a scale that few black enterprises had achieved, demonstrating that black female entrepreneurship could succeed massively. Walker became wealthy, visibly wealthy, in ways that contradicted every assumption about black women's place in America. She built a mansion in Harlem, hosted gatherings that brought together the leading figures of black America, became a philanthropist whose donations supported schools and churches and civil rights organizations. She was outspoken about racial justice, using her platform and her resources to fight discrimination even as she navigated the constraints that discrimination imposed. When she died in 1919, she left an estate worth over $1 million, an almost unimaginable sum for a black woman of her era, built entirely through her own efforts, her own vision, her own refusal to accept the limitations that the world tried to impose. Annie Malone preceded Walker with similar products and similar success, building Poro Company in St. Louis into an enterprise that employed thousands and generated millions. Malone developed the hot comb and the pressing oil that became staples of black hair care, trained the women who would spread these techniques across the country, created a model that Walker would later adapt and expand. Her Poro College was more than a training facility. It was a community center, a gathering place, a symbol of what black women could achieve. Malone became wealthy and philanthropic, donating generously to causes across Black America, demonstrating the community reinvestment that characterized the best black entrepreneurship. Both women faced the challenges common to all black entrepreneurs: the difficulties of accessing capital, the constraints of segregated markets, the need to navigate white hostility to black success. But they also found that the very exclusion that constrained them created opportunity, that serving needs that white businesses ignored could be the foundation of substantial wealth. Their success inspired countless other black women to pursue entrepreneurship, to see business ownership as a path to independence in a world that offered few such paths. The beauty industry became a launching pad for black female economic power, a sector where the double discrimination that limited options elsewhere became irrelevant because the customers and the entrepreneurs shared the same identity. The retail sector was more difficult, more exposed to white competition and white hostility. Black-owned grocery stores, dry goods stores, and general merchandise stores served black neighborhoods but faced constant pressure. White-owned stores could undercut their prices, absorbing short-term losses to drive black competitors out of business. Wholesalers could favor white retailers with better terms. Customers with limited funds might choose the white store with lower prices, even knowing that their money would leave the community. The black retailer had to compete on service, on credit, on community connection, building relationships that kept customers loyal even when purely economic calculation might send them elsewhere. Some black retail districts managed to thrive despite these pressures, creating concentrations of black-owned businesses that reinforced each other. Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Beale Street in Memphis, U Street in Washington, 18th and Vine in Kansas City, Central Avenue in Los Angeles. These became famous as centers of black commerce and culture, streets where black entrepreneurs could find customers, suppliers, and support systems that made success more possible. The clustering was partly defensive, businesses supporting each other against a hostile environment, and partly generative, the concentration creating opportunities that isolation wouldn't allow. A black entrepreneur on Auburn Avenue could find a black bank to provide a loan, a black insurance company to provide coverage, black suppliers and customers and colleagues who understood the challenges and celebrated the successes. But even these thriving districts existed at white sufferance, vulnerable to the same violence that destroyed Greenwood. Urban renewal in the mid-20th century would devastate many of them. Highways driven through black business districts, properties condemned and seized, communities scattered in the name of progress that somehow always required destroying black wealth. The entrepreneurs who had built businesses over decades found themselves displaced, their properties taken through eminent domain at prices that didn't reflect true value, their communities disrupted in ways that made rebuilding almost impossible. The pattern of destruction evolved from mobs with torches to governments with bulldozers, but the effect was similar. Black wealth erased, black communities disrupted, black entrepreneurship pushed back to the margins. Let's talk about the daily indignities, the 1,000 small humiliations that made black entrepreneurship during segregation so exhausting, even when the business was succeeding. These weren't occasional inconveniences, they were constant, inescapable, woven into every aspect of business life. You couldn't eat at the lunch counters where white businessmen gathered to make deals, couldn't sit down for a quick meal between appointments, couldn't participate in the casual socializing that built business relationships. You couldn't stay at the hotels where white salesmen stayed when traveling, the hotels near the train stations and in the business districts, the hotels with reliable service and professional amenities. You couldn't use the same restrooms, drink from the same fountains, sit in the same waiting rooms, ride in the same train cars. Every business trip required planning that white competitors never had to consider, logistics that consumed time and energy that could have gone into actually running the business. Where would you eat? Where would you sleep? Where would you find a bathroom when you needed one? These basic human needs became puzzles that required solving in every new town, every new situation. The Green Book existed because black travelers needed a guide to places that would serve them. A directory of hotels and restaurants and gas stations and beauty parlors that welcomed black customers. The book was essential, and it was also a monument to absurdity. The fact that such a guide needed to exist at all, an indictment of a system that forced people to plan their bathroom breaks weeks in advance. Some towns had no accommodations at all for black travelers. Sundown towns, they were called. Places where black people were not allowed after dark, where signs at the city limits made the rules explicit, where being caught after sunset could mean jail or worse. If your business required traveling through such areas, you had to plan your route carefully, make sure you could pass through during daylight, have contingency plans if something delayed you. The highways themselves were dangerous. Isolated stretches where a breakdown could leave you stranded in hostile territory, where the wrong interaction with the wrong local could turn fatal. Black travelers learned which gas stations would serve them, which mechanics would help them, which roads were safer, and which were best avoided entirely. The professional associations and business groups that helped white entrepreneurs network and share knowledge were closed to you, their doors shut as firmly as any lunch counter. The Chamber of Commerce didn't want black members, didn't want to acknowledge that black businesses existed, didn't want to share the resources and relationships that chamber membership provided. The Rotary Club didn't want black members. The Kiwanis Club didn't want black members. The golf courses where deals were made, where relationships were built over 18 holes, where business cards were exchanged and partnerships formed, didn't allow black players. You were excluded from the informal networks that are often as important as formal business arrangements. The conversations over drinks at the club, the referrals between members, the trust that develops when people know each other socially as well as professionally. Black entrepreneurs had to build their own networks, their own associations, their own ways of sharing knowledge and making connections. The National Negro Business League, founded by Booker T. Washington in 1900, brought black business owners together to share experiences and support each other. Local chapters in cities across America provided the networking opportunities that mainstream groups denied. These parallel institutions served their communities well, created real value, built relationships that sustained black business districts for generations, but they couldn't access the resources that white networks controlled, couldn't provide introductions to white suppliers or white customers or white investors, couldn't open doors that remained firmly closed regardless of qualifications or achievements. The legal system offered no protection when things went wrong. If a white customer refused to pay a debt, good luck collecting through the courts. If a white business partner cheated you, good luck getting a judgment. If a white competitor spread lies about your business, good luck suing for defamation. The courts were white courts, the judges were white judges, the juries were white juries, and they all knew which side they were supposed to favor. Black entrepreneurs learned not to rely on legal remedies, learned to structure deals in ways that minimized risk because there was no recourse when risk materialized, learned that handshakes with white businessmen were worth exactly as much as white businessmen wanted them to be worth. The tax system added another layer of extraction. You paid taxes like everyone else, but the services those taxes funded often didn't reach your neighborhood. The roads in the black part of town stayed unpaved, while white neighborhoods got asphalt. The schools that black children attended were starved of resources while white schools flourished. The police who your taxes paid for were more likely to harass you than protect you. You funded your own marginalization, and if you complained, you made yourself a target. Some black entrepreneurs found ways to minimize tax exposure, operating in cash economies that kept transactions invisible, not because they were dishonest, but because every dollar sent to a government that didn't serve them was a dollar taken from communities that desperately needed it. And yet, despite all of this, black entrepreneurs persisted. They built businesses and accumulated wealth and created opportunities and served their communities and proved every racist assumption wrong. The sheer improbability of their success makes it all the more remarkable. They weren't supposed to succeed. Every part of the system was designed to prevent their success, and they succeeded anyway, through brilliance and determination and sacrifice that white entrepreneurs never had to match. They did it for themselves, for their families, for their communities, for a future they might not live to see, but that their children and grandchildren might inherit. The legacy of black entrepreneurship during segregation is complicated. The businesses that survived created foundations for later generations. The institutions that emerged, the banks and insurance companies and professional associations, continue to serve black communities today. The lessons learned about resilience and adaptation and community solidarity remain relevant. But the losses were enormous, not just the businesses destroyed by violence, but the businesses that were never started, the ideas that were never pursued, the wealth that was never accumulated because the system made accumulation impossible. The gap between black and white wealth in America today traces directly back to the policies and practices of the segregation era, to the systematic prevention of black economic advancement that continued for nearly a century after slavery ended. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about what it took to build something during those years. Think about the entrepreneurs who saved for decades to open businesses that could be destroyed in an hour. Think about the calculations they had to make, the dangers they had to navigate, the indignities they had to swallow just to survive. Think about Madam C.J. Walker building an empire from a nothing, about the funeral directors serving their communities in grief, about the bankers and insurers creating institutions that would outlast them. Think about Greenwood burning, about all the other Greenwoods that burned, about the wealth that was stolen and the wealth that was never allowed to exist in the first place. But think also about what they accomplished despite everything. The businesses they built, the communities they served, the children they educated with profits that should have been larger but were enough. The legacy they left, imperfect and incomplete, but real, tangible, still present in black-owned businesses today that carry forward traditions established by people who refuse to accept that the system's verdict on their potential was final. They proved something that the system spent enormous resources trying to disprove. that black people could build, could succeed, could create wealth and opportunity when given any chance at all. That proof mattered then, and it matters now, and it will keep mattering as long as the fight for economic justice continues. Let their stubborn persistence carry you into peaceful sleep. Congratulations. You're free. You have the papers to prove it, folded carefully in your pocket, worn soft at the creases from being unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. Maybe your grandmother was freed by an enslaver who had a crisis of conscience on his deathbed. Maybe your mother saved for 20 years, hiring herself out on Sundays, scraping together enough coin to purchase her own flesh from the man who claimed to own it. Maybe you were born to parents who were already free, which makes you one of the lucky ones, though lucky is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Either way, you're not enslaved. You can't be sold. You can't be whipped at another man's pleasure. You can't be separated from your family on a Tuesday because someone needed cash. The good news ends there, because being free and being safe are two entirely different things. And in the antebellum South, free black people learned that distinction the hard way, every single day, from the moment they woke up until the moment they managed to fall into an uneasy sleep. Let's start with the papers, because those papers are your life. Without them, you're presumed to be an escaped slave. With them, you're merely a suspicious anomaly that makes white people uncomfortable. Your freedom papers need to be registered with the local court, which means white officials know exactly who you are, where you live, and that you exist in a category they find philosophically troubling. Every time you travel, even to the next county, you need to carry those papers. Every time a white person demands to see them, you need to produce them immediately, with a smile, with deference, with gratitude for being allowed to prove you're not property. If your papers get lost, stolen, damaged, or destroyed, you have a serious problem. Replacing them requires going back to court, finding witnesses who can testify to your status, paying fees you probably can't afford, and hoping the judge is in a generous mood, rather than the mood that says maybe this one should be sold for the county's benefit. Some free black people carried multiple copies. Some memorized the exact wording so they could recite it if needed. Some sewed papers into the linings of their clothes. The paranoia was justified. Without documentation, freedom evaporated like morning fog. Here's where it gets really precarious. The entire Southern economy depended on slavery, and free black people represented a living contradiction to the ideology that made slavery possible. If black people could be free, could work, could own property, could raise families, could exist as human beings rather than livestock, then maybe the whole system was built on a lie. That possibility made white Southerners deeply uncomfortable. And when white Southerners got uncomfortable, black people suffered. The slavocracy needed everyone to believe that black people were inherently inferior, naturally suited for bondage, incapable of self-governance. Every free black person who worked hard, raised a family, stayed out of trouble, and lived a respectable life was a walking refutation of that ideology. And ideologies under threat tend to produce desperate measures. So the laws governing free black lives were designed to make freedom as miserable as possible without technically being slavery. You couldn't vote, obviously. The ballot box was for white men only, and your opinions on governance were not requested. You couldn't testify against white people in court, which meant any white person could rob you, assault you, or destroy your property with near impunity. If a white man walked into your shop, took what he wanted, and walked out without paying, your only recourse was to find another white person willing to testify on your behalf, which was roughly as likely as finding gold in your breakfast porridge. You couldn't own firearms in most places, leaving you defenseless against the very people most likely to harm you. You couldn't gather in groups without white supervision, because apparently free black people sitting around talking was a threat to civilization itself. 3 black men discussing the weather might be plotting rebellion, as far as white authorities were concerned. You couldn't learn to read in some states, and you definitely couldn't teach other black people to read, because literacy was power, and power was dangerous in the wrong hands. You couldn't preach without a license, and licenses were hard to get and easy to revoke, because the authorities worried about what you might say and who might listen. You couldn't own certain types of property in certain places. You couldn't enter certain professions. You couldn't travel freely. You couldn't marry who you wanted, at least not legally, not in ways the state would recognize. You were free, technically, but freedom came with an asterisk the size of a plantation, and the fine print went on for pages. Now imagine trying to make a living under these conditions. You wake up in whatever cramped room or small house you've managed to secure, and you need to work because nobody's providing for you. Unlike enslaved people who were fed and housed by their enslavers, however inadequately, you were on your own. Your meals depended on your earnings. Your shelter depended on your rent. Every expense came out of your own pocket, and your pocket had holes in it that the law kept cutting wider. But the jobs available to free black people were limited by law and custom to the lowest rungs of the economy. You could be a laborer, hauling and lifting until your back gave out, competing with enslaved workers who could be hired out for less than you needed to survive. You could be a domestic servant, cleaning white people's houses and raising white people's children, invisible in their homes while being indispensable to their comfort. You could work on the docks, loading and unloading ships in the blistering heat, surrounded by enslaved workers doing the same jobs, the line between free and enslaved blurring in the sweat and exhaustion. You could be a craftsman if you'd somehow acquired a skill, a blacksmith or carpenter or barber or shoemaker. But even then, you faced restrictions that white craftsmen didn't face. Some cities required you to have a white guardian or sponsor who would vouch for your behavior and your business practices. Some states prohibited you from certain trades entirely, protecting white workers from the competition of black workers who might be willing to charge less or work harder. In some places, you couldn't hire white workers even if your business grew large enough to need help, because the sight of a white person working for a black person violated the natural order of things. If you were good at what you did, if you prospered even modestly, you attracted attention and resentment. A free black person with a nice coat or a well-built house was an offense against the entire ideology of white supremacy, a living argument that black people could thrive if given half a chance. And making that argument too loudly could get you killed. Let's talk about the guardian system, because this was one of the more insidious mechanisms of control. In many southern states, free black people were required to have a white guardian, essentially a sponsor who took legal responsibility for their behavior. This guardian could be a former enslaver, a sympathetic white friend, or simply someone willing to take on the role for a fee. Without a guardian, you might not be able to conduct business, sign contracts, or even remain in the state. The guardian had power over you that looked uncomfortably like ownership. They could restrict your movements, control your finances, and in some cases hire you out to other white people and keep the wages. If your guardian died, moved away, or simply decided they didn't want the responsibility anymore, you were suddenly unmoored, scrambling to find someone else willing to take on a role that most white people found distasteful or simply not worth the trouble. The system transformed freedom into a kind of supervised parole, with white people serving as perpetual probation officers for the crime of the existing while black. And then there were the taxes. Free black people in the antebellum South paid special taxes that white people didn't pay, essentially fines for the audacity of not being enslaved. Some states charged an annual head tax on every free black resident. Some required free black people to pay for their own registration, their own court appearances, their own documentation of a status that should have been self-evident. The money went into state coffers, or sometimes into the pockets of the officials collecting it, and the effect was to make free black life economically precarious even when work was available. You earned less than white workers, paid more in taxes and fees, faced restrictions on accumulating property, and lived one bad month away from disaster. Some free black people who fell behind on taxes or fees found themselves sold into slavery to cover the debt. Freedom, it turned out, had a price that came due annually, and if you couldn't pay, the state would find a way to reclaim what it had reluctantly granted. Here's something that kept free black people awake at night: kidnapping. The domestic slave trade was booming in the antebellum period, with enslaved people from the Upper South being sold to the cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South at enormous profit. A healthy young black man could fetch over $1,000 at auction, a sum that represented years of wages for most white workers. A skilled craftsman might bring even more. Women of childbearing age were valuable for their labor and their potential to produce more enslaved workers. Children were investments in future labor. This created a powerful incentive for unscrupulous men to grab free black people off the streets, destroy their papers, and sell them into slavery hundreds of miles from anyone who might recognize them. Professional kidnappers operated throughout the South and even ventured into northern states to snatch victims. They worked alone or in gangs, sometimes with the cooperation of corrupt officials who would certify stolen people as legitimate property. They had networks of contacts, safe houses where victims could be held, forged documents that created paper trails of ownership. Some posed as legitimate slave traders. Others operated as outright criminals, grabbing people in the night and transporting them before anyone knew they were missing. The techniques were sophisticated because the profits were substantial, and the risks were minimal, given that a kidnapped person couldn't testify against their kidnappers. Once you were sold and transported, proving your free status became nearly impossible. You couldn't testify in court against white people. You had no papers because they'd been destroyed or confiscated. You were in a strange place where no one knew you, where no one had any reason to believe you over the white man who claimed to own you. Your word meant nothing against the bill of sale that some white man had fabricated. Even if you managed to get word to family or friends back home, what could they do? Travel hundreds of miles to testify in a court that didn't want to hear from them? Hire lawyers with money they didn't have? The system was designed to make recovery impossible. The stories of free black people who spent decades in slavery after being kidnapped, who sometimes never escaped at all, who died in bondage protesting to the end that they were free. These stories were common knowledge in free black communities. Parents warned children never to go anywhere alone. People traveled in groups when possible, hoping that numbers would discourage kidnappers looking for easy targets. Some simply never left their immediate neighborhoods, accepting a constrained life as the price of a safer one. The fear was constant, justified, and impossible to ever completely escape. Every stranger was potentially dangerous. Every journey was a risk calculation. The legal system offered little protection and considerable danger. Remember, you couldn't testify against white people. This single restriction undermined any possibility of justice. So if a white man beat you, robbed you, or burn down your house. You couldn't take the stand to describe what happened. You couldn't point at your attacker and say, "This is the man who did it." You couldn't present your side of the story to judge or jury. You needed a white witness willing to testify on your behalf. And white witnesses willing to testify against other white people on behalf of a black person were rare creatures, indeed. Those who did often faced social consequences, being labeled as race traitors or troublemakers, finding their own standing in the community damaged by association with your cause. The courts were staffed by white judges elected by white voters, interpreting laws written by white legislators, applying standards that assumed black inferiority as a given. White juries decided cases involving black defendants, and those juries generally believed that black people were inferior, that slavery was right and natural, and that free black people were a nuisance at best and a menace at worst. Getting justice in this system was like trying to win a game where the other side made all the rules and could change them whenever convenient. The dice were loaded, the deck was stacked, and the house always won. And if you were accused of a crime, heaven help you. Black defendants faced harsher sentences than white defendants for identical offenses. The presumption of innocence that supposedly governed American courts evaporated when the defendant was black. Juries were quick to convict and judges were quick to sentence. For minor offenses that would earn white people fines or short jail terms, black defendants might face years of labor, public whipping, or worse. Some free black people convicted of crimes were sold into slavery as punishment, their freedom forfeit over offenses that barely qualified as misdemeanors when committed by white people. The threat of the courtroom was another tool of control, another reminder that your freedom existed at the sufferance of a system designed to deny it. Let's talk about the constant threat of expulsion, because your right to remain in the state where you'd built your entire life was never secure. Throughout the antebellum period, Southern states passed increasingly restrictive laws aimed at reducing the free black population. Some states required newly freed black people to leave within a certain period or face re-enslavement. Some prohibited free black people from other states from entering, trapping existing residents while preventing others from joining them. Some states periodically debated whether to expel all free black people entirely, sending them to Liberia or some other distant place, eliminating the troublesome reminder that black and free could exist in the same body. Even when these expulsion proposals failed to become law, the debates themselves sent a message. You were tolerated, not accepted. Your presence was a problem that white people were constantly trying to solve. The ground beneath your feet was never stable. The community you'd built, the business you'd established, the family you'd raised could be swept away by a single legislative session if the political wind shifted. Free black people lived with this uncertainty constantly, knowing that their status depended not on rights, but on the fluctuating tolerance of people who saw them as a mistake. Movement was particularly fraught. If you needed to travel, to visit family in another county, to deliver goods to a customer, to attend a funeral or a wedding, to seek work in a nearby town, you faced a gauntlet of checkpoints, both official and informal. You needed your papers, obviously, but papers were not always enough. You also needed to avoid attracting the attention of the slave patrols that roamed the roads looking for runaways. These patrols, called patty rollers in the vernacular of the time, had the authority to stop any black person, free or enslaved, and demand proof of status. The patrols were often poor white men, resentful of their own position at the bottom of white society, taking out their frustrations on people they considered beneath them. They had legal authority and no oversight. They could stop you, question you, search your belongings, examine your papers with illiterate scrutiny, and decide whether you looked like someone who should be out on the road. Being stopped by a patrol meant being questioned about where you came from and where you were going, why you were traveling, and who could vouch for you. It meant being searched for weapons, for stolen goods, for messages that might be passing between enslaved people. It meant sometimes being beaten even when your papers were in order, because the papers said you were free, but the patrol said you had a suspicious attitude. And who was the court going to believe? Your word against theirs wasn't even admissible as evidence. Some free black people simply stopped traveling, limiting their lives to a small radius where they were known, where local whites could vouch for them, where the danger of a random encounter with strangers was minimized. This meant turning down opportunities, missing family events, letting the world shrink to a size that felt manageable rather than the size it should have been. Others traveled only in groups, hoping numbers would provide some protection, hoping that witnesses might discourage the worst abuses. They traveled during daylight when possible, along known routes, carrying documentation of their destinations as well as their origins. Everyone knew someone who had been detained, beaten, jailed, or worse simply for being in the wrong place while black. The roads were not free, no matter what your papers said. The social isolation was grinding. You existed in a middle space that belonged to no one, neither fully free nor enslaved, neither accepted by whites nor entirely trusted by the enslaved. Enslaved people might view you with suspicion, wondering if you thought yourself better than them, wondering if you would use your relative freedom to help them or to distance yourself from their condition, wondering whose side you were really on when push came to shove. Some enslaved people resented free black people for enjoying privileges they were denied. Others admired and envied them. The relationships were complicated by the chasm of legal status that separated people who might otherwise have been natural allies. White people viewed you as a contradiction and a threat, a living refutation of everything they believed about race and destiny. Your very existence argued against the ideology that justified slavery, and that made you dangerous regardless of how carefully you conducted yourself. You couldn't socialize with white people as equals, obviously. The color line was absolute in social situations, policed by custom and violence. But your interactions with enslaved people were also constrained by law and circumstance. Marrying an enslaved person meant your children would be born into slavery, following the condition of the mother. That knowledge haunted every romantic relationship that crossed the line between free and enslaved. Love was insufficient protection against a legal system that didn't recognize black love as worthy of protection. Befriending enslaved people too publicly attracted scrutiny, since white people worried that free black people would spread dangerous ideas about freedom, would help enslaved people escape, would foment the rebellions that slaveholders feared constantly. You had to be careful about who you talked to, how long you talked, what you were seen doing. Even innocent interactions could be interpreted as conspiracy. Some free black people owned enslaved people themselves, a fact that complicates any simple narrative about this period. Sometimes this ownership was a legal fiction to protect family members they couldn't otherwise free, a spouse or child purchased, but not manumitted because the law made manumission difficult or impossible. Sometimes it was genuine investment in the system that oppressed them. Free black people buying enslaved workers to run their businesses, participating in an economy built on bondage, because that was the only economy available. The moral compromises required to survive were constant and corrosive. You did what you had to do, and you tried not to think too hard about what that did to your soul. But the thinking came anyway, in quiet moments, in sleepless nights, in the face of your reflection. Now let's talk about family, because maintaining a family as a free black person in the antebellum South was an exercise in constant anxiety that would drive modern people to madness. If your spouse was enslaved, they could be sold at any moment, sent hundreds of miles away, and there was nothing you could do about it legally. You could beg. You could try to scrape together money to purchase them. You could appeal to the enslaver's sense of decency, if any existed. But in the end, they were property, and property could be disposed of as the owner saw fit. You might wake up one morning to find that your husband or wife had been sold overnight, that they were already on a wagon heading south, that you would never see them again as long as you lived. If your children were born to an enslaved mother, they were born enslaved regardless of your status, following the legal principle that children inherited the condition of the mother. You might have to watch your own children grow up in bondage, might have to see them working in fields or houses, might have to witness them being disciplined by enslavers who had no stake in their well-being. You might have to purchase your own children if you ever wanted them free, going to their legal owner with hat in hand, negotiating a price for flesh that you had helped create. You might have to see them sold away before you could accumulate enough money, shipped off to distant plantations while you stood helpless, their cries fading down the road. Some free black men worked for decades to purchase their wives and children, saving every penny, taking extra jobs, denying themselves comforts, only to see the prices rise faster than their savings. The enslaver might change their mind, might decide they wanted more money, might simply refuse to sell because they enjoyed the power of refusal. Some men finally succeeded, after years of effort, and then faced the realization that they now technically own their own family members, a legal relationship that twisted something sacred into something obscene. Manumitting purchased family members was itself complicated, sometimes requiring court approval, sometimes forbidden by law, sometimes triggering requirements that the freed person leave the state. The bureaucracy of bondage wrapped itself around families like chains, constraining even when it couldn't directly enslave. The emotional toll was immense. Every pregnancy was shadowed by fear about the child's status. Every birth was complicated by calculations of freedom and bondage. Every family gathering reminded you of who wasn't there, who might not be there next time, whose presence depended on the whims of white people who saw them as property. The anxiety never fully lifted. You couldn't plan for the future because the future was contingent on forces beyond your control. You loved knowing that love might not be enough to keep your family together. That knowledge sat in your chest like a stone, cold and heavy and impossible to forget. The church was supposed to be a refuge, and in some ways it was. Free black people in the antebellum South built their own congregations when they could, finding in religion a space where they could gather, sing, pray, and support each other. The church was one of the few institutions they could control, one of the few places where black leadership was possible, one of the few spaces where the constant performance of deference could be set aside, if only for a few hours. In church, a black man could be a deacon, a leader, a voice of authority. A black woman could sing without apology, could feel the Spirit move through her without worrying about white disapproval. The sanctuary was a space apart, and that apartness was precious. But even churches were regulated by the suspicious white gaze. Many states required that a white minister be present at all black religious gatherings, presumably to ensure that nothing seditious was being preached, that no plans for rebellion were being hatched beneath the cover of hymns. This white observer sat in judgment. listening for anything that might suggest resistance, anything that might need to be reported to the authorities. The presence poisoned the sanctuary, made even prayer feel supervised, turned worship into performance. Some states prohibited black churches entirely after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, blaming religious gatherings for fomenting resistance, seeing in every prayer meeting a potential conspiracy. Turner had been a preacher, and his rebellion had terrified white Southerners into crackdowns that lasted for decades. Where independent black churches existed, they were watched, harassed, sometimes burned. Ministers were questioned about their sermons. Congregations were dispersed by patrols. The message was clear. Even your relationship with God had to be supervised by white people. Even your prayers were suspect. Even your hope for salvation needed to be approved by those who saw themselves as your earthly masters. Some free black people attended white churches, sitting in segregated sections, listening to sermons that told them slavery was divine will, that obedience was their highest calling, that their proper place was somewhere below the white people who claimed to be saving their souls. The spiritual nourishment such churches offered was thin indeed, mixed with poison, telling you that your condition was God's will, while your soul screamed that God wanted something better for all his children. Education was another battleground. Learning to read and write was dangerous, forbidden in some states, restricted in others, always viewed with suspicion by white authorities who understood that literacy was power. A literate black person could read abolitionist newspapers smuggled down from the north. They could write passes for escaping enslaved people, forging the documents that might mean the difference between freedom and capture. They could communicate ideas that threatened the entire system, could correspond with allies, could record the injustices they witnessed for posterity. So states made it illegal to teach black people to read, free, or enslaved, punishing teachers and students alike. Schools for free black children were closed by law or by mob. Their teachers, sometimes white abolitionists, and sometimes free black people themselves, were arrested, fined, driven out of town, occasionally beaten. Students were dispersed, their books confiscated, their dreams of education criminalized. The message was clear. Ignorance was the natural condition for black people, and any attempt to change that condition was a crime against the social order. Some free black people learned anyway, in secret sessions conducted in back rooms and woods, with books hidden beneath floorboards, with lessons whispered so quietly that neighbors wouldn't hear. Parents taught children late at night, by candlelight, risking everything for the knowledge that might someday set them free in ways that legal freedom couldn't achieve. The hunger for knowledge was strong enough to risk punishment, because education represented something beyond practical skill. It represented the assertion that black minds were as capable as white minds, that the ideology of inferiority was a lie, that freedom might someday mean more than just not being owned. Every letter learned was an act of rebellion. Every word read was a victory against a system designed to keep black people in darkness. Let's talk about what happened when things went wrong, because things went wrong constantly. A fire destroys your workshop, and you have no insurance, no savings, and no white guardian willing to extend credit. A recession hits, and the customers who tolerated you in good times find white craftsmen during hard times. A new law passes, and suddenly your occupation is restricted. Your residence is questioned. Your right to remain is challenged. You get sick, and there's no hospital that will admit you, no doctor willing to treat you, no safety net except whatever your community can provide. You grow old, and there's no pension, no retirement, no guarantee that you won't end your days in poverty no matter how hard you worked. The precariousness was exhausting. You could do everything right, follow every rule, defer to every white person, pay every tax, and still watch everything collapse because the system wasn't designed for you to succeed. It was designed to make you fail, to prove that free black people couldn't thrive, to justify either re-enslavement or expulsion as the only solutions to the problem of your existence. And through all of this, you watched the enslaved people around you and knew that their fate and yours were bound together. The same ideology that justified their chains justified your restrictions. The same fear that kept them in bondage kept you in this peculiar half-freedom. When enslaved people resisted, when they ran away or rebelled, the restrictions on free black people tightened. Every Nat Turner produced a wave of new laws aimed at all black people, free or enslaved, as if liberty itself were contagious and needed to be quarantined. You understood that your freedom, such as it was, existed only because it was useful to white people in some way, or because eliminating it would be more trouble than tolerating it. You were a pawn in a larger game, your status contingent on political calculations you couldn't influence, your future determined by debates in legislatures where you had no voice and no vote. Some free black people accumulated property anyway. Through skill, luck, and relentless work, they built businesses, bought land, even acquired wealth by the standards of their time. A few became genuinely prosperous, owning substantial property, employing workers, living in houses that rivaled those of middling white families. These success stories were remarkable precisely because they were so difficult, achieved against obstacles that would have crushed most people. But success brought its own dangers. A prosperous free black person attracted envy, resentment, accusations. White neighbors might claim that the property was acquired illegally, that the business competed unfairly, that something must be wrong because a black person couldn't possibly have earned what they had. Some successful free black people were driven out by mobs, their property destroyed, their years of work reduced to ashes. Others were cheated by white partners who knew that a black person couldn't testify against them in court. Still others simply disappeared, their fate unknown, their property absorbed by white neighbors who claimed it had been abandoned. The psychological weight of living this way was immense. You performed deference constantly, smiling when you wanted to scream, thanking people who insulted you, agreeing with opinions that denied your humanity. You learned to read white moods, to sense when danger was approaching, to make yourself small and unthreatening in situations where your size or confidence might be perceived as a challenge. You watched your words, knowing that the wrong comment to the wrong person could mean disaster. You watched your children, trying to teach them the survival skills they'd need, trying to prepare them for a world that hated them, without crushing the spirits that you wanted them to keep. The stress was constant. The vigilance was exhausting. The anger had nowhere to go except inward, where it curdled into something that had to be managed, controlled, hidden from the very people who caused it. And yet, free black people in the antebellum South didn't just survive. They built communities. They established churches and mutual aid societies. They created schools where they could, educated their children in secret where they couldn't. They maintained family connections across distances and legal barriers. They preserved traditions and created new ones. They found joy where joy could be found, in music and food and fellowship, in the small pleasures that couldn't be taxed or regulated away. They resisted in ways large and small, helping enslaved people escape, harboring runaways, passing information along networks that white people never fully understood. They held onto dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. They insisted on their humanity in a society that denied it. That insistence, that stubborn refusal to accept the terms being offered, was itself a form of resistance, a daily rebellion against the ideology that said they shouldn't exist. The end came eventually. The Civil War erupted. The Confederacy rose and fell. Emancipation became law, and then constitutional amendment. Suddenly all black people were free, at least on paper, and the peculiar category of free black Southerners disappeared into a larger population facing different but related challenges. But the antebellum period left its marks. The restrictions, the humiliations, the constant danger, the survival strategies, all of it shaped communities and families for generations. The knowledge that freedom could be conditional, that rights could be taken as easily as given, that white tolerance was not the same as white acceptance. This knowledge passed down through families who had learned it the hard way. The vigilance didn't disappear when slavery ended. It couldn't. The dangers simply evolved into new forms. Jim Crow replacing the black codes, sundown towns replacing expulsion laws, police replacing slave patrols. The free black people of the antebellum South had learned to navigate a world that wanted them gone or subjugated, and that skill would be needed for a long time to come. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about what it meant to be free in a land of slavery. Think about carrying papers that proved your humanity to people who denied it anyway. Think about building a life on ground that could shift beneath you at any moment. Think about loving people whose freedom you couldn't guarantee, raising children into a future you couldn't control. Think about the courage it took to simply exist, to wake up every morning and face another day of the obstacles designed to break you. The free black people of the antebellum South didn't choose their circumstances. They chose how to respond to them. They chose survival and community and resistance. They chose to treat each other as fully human even when the law and society said otherwise. They chose hope when despair would have been easier. That choice, made daily, made hourly, made in the face of everything that told them to give up, is what we remember tonight. Their freedom was compromised, constrained, constantly threatened, but it was theirs. They held onto it with everything they had, and eventually they expanded it to include everyone. Rest now and let their perseverance carry you into peaceful sleep.